Hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas Garza, and I'll be doing my presentation on an article by Caroline Hoggood entitled Exploring the Architecture of Narrative in House of Leaves. Um, you know, Obviously, this novel, when we first were given it as an assignment for class, I kind of looked up some synopsises of it and was kind of just all over the place, it seemed to me, and I couldn't really find one true explanation for it, which I guess in a sense explains a lot about the novel. Didn't really know what to expect going into it, but I did find myself really enjoying it and reading way ahead at sometimes. Um, Even with the way the story is kind of laid out and the structure and everything, and it's still, I think once you get the hang of it, it's obviously a very interesting and very different read. Um, First off, for starters, House of Leaves is an interpretive challenge even for the most intrepid readers. Like I'm saying, it's obviously very different. Layouts very different. Like we talked about last week in the lit chat, it's written in a way that's not a typical novel, and I think that alone obviously makes it stand out, but it also kind of can confuse the reader. But in a way, I think that was hopefully an intention of the author. um, the article explores the narrative structure of the article that I'm talking about. Sorry, I kind of confused myself. The article explores the narrative structure of the novel and how it is all over the place in terms of who's telling the story and the way that the ongoing story is told, even with stories overlapping, but coming to some of the same conclusions and points. Um, the novel obviously can be innovative and is architectural, has an architectural textured layout corresponding to the plot that kind of mimics the house. Um, the story is all very confusing and especially with the footnotes and everything you're supposed to read, and it refers to different pages farther ahead and some farther back, and it kind of, the layout kind of mimics the way the house is kind of topsy turvy all over the place, and you end up here, you go in here, you come out here, and I think it's very interesting that the way it was written kind of was meant to mimic the house. On every page, on every slide, I tried to put some sort of picture, and I I googled House of Leaves fan art, and this meme of sorts came up with Flanders and some sort of house that kind of looked like it was maybe the hallway. And the title was "Don't Be Scared," and the guy and Flanders was saying, "I dang doodly am." And that's kind of how I felt reading this book. I dang doodly am scared of it. Also, the author. I mean, calling anyone who contributes to the overall story of the novel an author can be confusing as well, considering at any time there's multiple storylines going across happening. We have the Navidson story that's obviously the story of the video recording. We have Drawing Truant telling his story of how he came across the writings and how he started to put them together. And then we have the way he wrote it with Samporo, and then we have the footnotes. I feel like the footnotes tell their own story in some ways, and it can be very confusing. Uh, the novel's innovative in architectural layout. Story's layout, being obviously innovative and different, having an architectural layout comparing it to the house, like I said, allows the reader to discover the story in a new way while still being able to keep the overall narrative. Another good point Hoghead points out is that the novel seems to avoid being placed in any sort of category. Um, I found that particularly interesting simply because, a lot of people do say the story is a horror story. Um, and I agree with that. There was parts that kind of had me kind of like, feeling creepy, especially when they were down in the stairwell, and the figure was pointing a gun at them. It was a weird image, but overall, I think it does follow a traditional horror story. But there's a love story going on, or some sort of love story with Navidson and his wife, and then there's the attic story, I would say, with Johnny Truant, and then you have Samporo's whole thing going on. So there's very different uh, categories of genre we could put it in, but I don't think that it necessarily adheres to a certain one. Although I do feel like a lot of reviews I've read and things place it in the horror story category, which obviously is completely okay. Daniel Linsky asked the readers early on in the novel not to seek answer, but take note of how each new interpretation alters the structure and the narrative of the house. The author also asked the reader to focus on experiencing rather than trying to define. This just stuck out to me because I feel like a lot of times with not just this story, but in general, everyone people try to over explain things, and I feel like sometimes it's just not necessary. You don't really need to over explain something when it's you don't you should have to. And I think that the Hagud, speaks to Daniel Linsky, saying that he asks us not to seek answer in some things, not to point out the fact that something's happening in a certain way. Maybe that's because of this and this is because of that. I think he just wants us to take it as it is and experience the novel for what it is, which is something that's very different, and nothing might, there might be plenty of interpretations to something, and there might be, might not mean anything at all. And I think that's the best part about when we do interpret it. Nobody could be wrong. I think it's hard to say anybody could be wrong with anything they feel. Um, this kind of shows how our world is constantly changing too. Instead of things being straightforward, things are very left to interpretation a lot of times. Um, I know Professor posted a meme similar to this one with Charlie from the mailroom. I saw this one. I really liked. I liked the way it said "House of Leaves." It's very simple. Is a very simple read. Simple, really. And in truth, it's not. And I think it kind of matches up to the story with him and his crazy lines of how the mail, Carol, kind of all over the place. There's really not certain focus on anything. Um, the collective experience. Parts of the house can be considered spaces of collective experience. For example, the great hall is an area in the house that can hold many people, allowing their stories to be told together in the same space. The labyrinth at the heart of the novel is not only a single location, but a trope for the intricate structural composition of the authors of the novel. I think that tries to explain that line from the article tries to explain the fact that the labyrinth, while is very intricate and different and all over the place. That's kind of how the authors are. It doesn't seem to me that so far in reading that any of the authors really line up with each other completely, except for maybe an instance or two. But this seems like they're all back and forth. Like we go from Navidson back to Johnny Truant, and then to Empora, and some footnotes here and there, and just back and forth. And it's not, you know, it's a very intricate structural composition as far as this novel goes. And the Great Hall, I see that as a joining point. I know that we don't really see Johnny Truant with them, but I feel like the stories that we see, with Tom and Navidson and his wife, and even the kids sometimes, and their neighbors and the teacher, they all kind of meet up in the Great Hall and then go their own ways. Navidson is constantly, um, in a battle for a personal journey and then the journey of self of his group, his family. He fights that all the time. In conclusion, throughout the novel, Dan Linsky turns the conventional notion of the mind inside out by having a narrative that is experimental, hardly familiar, but still very interesting and effective. Um, you know, I think Daniel Linsky tries to balance us in a carefully controlled tension between the personal and command role of the narrative. And something, the article pointed out was that Samporo notes that the exploration in number 4 can be considered a personal journey. And I agree with that. Um, like I said, parts of the house can be considered collective experience, and I feel like when they go into even when Navidson goes back down into them to try and rescue them, I feel like he made the decision then and there to make it a personal journey, make it about him, and I just feel like that kind of speaks a lot to that. Daniel Insky writes from a space in the middle of history and fiction, public and private. That was the line from the article that kind of stuck out to me too. Conventional notion of the mind is turned inside out, and that one stuck out to me even more so because you kind of think of the novel as a certain thing, and the author obviously turns it upside down and makes us see things in a completely different way. And this picture kind of gives you an idea of how the house could be viewed. You see the stairs upside down. Just that's how the novel seems to me, just all over the place. And I hope by the end I have a better understanding of everything. I'm sure we will. I might need another read one time in the future. Maybe things will click. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you for listening.